I wanted to introduce you to a place which experiences isolation from the rest of the world for up to 9 months of the year, every year. Yet it's the only continent on Earth which is currently totally free of COVID-19. It's Antarctica. The coldest, the windiest, the driest, and the least populated continent on the planet. It's the size of the USA and Mexico together, and yet it has a population of only 10,000 people in its short summer and 2,000 in its long winter. That means it has a density of population of just 0.2 people per square mile. And as a comparison, the UK has a population of 737 people per square mile. This evening, I'm going to talk about 4 different projects on which I've been working in the Antarctic. Our firm have been working in Antarctica since 2005, and I'm going to show you 2 projects which we've completed and 2 which are ongoing, focusing particularly on the design devices which we've used to overcome the isolation and sensory deprivations of this icy continent. The first station I'm going to look at is Halley, which is operated by the British Antarctic Survey, who are based in Cambridge. It's at 75 degrees south and it's on the coast of Antarctica, and yet it's only 900 miles from the South Pole. It's situated on a floating ice shelf. This means that the ice has flowed off the main continent of the Antarctic and is actually supported on the Weddell Sea underneath. The ice is 150 meters thick, and because it's flowing off the main continent, it's actually flowing at a rate of around 400 meters per year towards the sea. On your screens at the moment, you can see Halley V, the previous station, which comprised of a series of separate buildings. Off to the right-hand side was the main living platform called the Laws Building. In the middle and off to the left are 2 science platforms, one for near ice climatology and one for researching the outer atmosphere. It gets unbelievably cold at Halley. The temperatures drop to -56 degrees Celsius in the middle of winter and rise to a balmy -2 degrees in the middle of the summer. And when the temperatures rise in the summer, so the winds flowing off the main plateau increase in speed, reaching up to 100 to 150 miles per hour. And as they blow towards the buildings, they start forming significant drifts, burying everything that's left on the surface, whether that's a skidoo, a screwdriver, or even a building. And the only time really that all the residents of the station properly come together was for the annual jacking of the buildings to raise them above the ice level by around 1 meter per annum to allow the wind to accelerate underneath and prevent them from getting entirely buried by snowdrifts. As well as blowing winds and low temperatures, the station also experiences 105 days of total darkness. That means that the sun does not rise above the horizon for over 3 months. And during the winter, when the crew reduces from around 60 down to around 15 people, they have to live in 24-hour darkness. And in the previous station, this was the kind of spaces that they lived in. Everything was split off into individual or cellular rooms. So you had 1 room for the dining room, 1 room for the bar, 1 room for watching TV. And you would find that the base would be made up of a mixture of different people. Some who were quite gregarious and who enjoyed going to the bar or watching TV, or others who found that the sound of other people enjoying themselves in the bar or watching TV was just too much, and they couldn't bring themselves to open the door. So they would gently creep up and down the corridor, developing what was known as the Halley stair. That corridor was useful for many things for the residents of Halley, not least when after 2.5 years of acting as a scientist in Antarctica, you received a fax or an email from your loved one saying, "I'm so sorry, but I've met someone else." And rather than having to declare to everybody that you'd been dumped, people would just print out the Dear John faxes and emails, pin them up on the wall and leave them for their colleagues to have a little read and then commiserate with them afterwards. And when it comes to going and meeting other people, social distancing principles could not be applied when going to visit the other local residents in that part of the Brunt ice shelf. Instead, you had to abseil your way down the ice cliffs and then go and see the large penguin colony at what's called Creek 2, probably around 10 to 15,000 emperor penguins all co-located in one place. And when you need a food delivery, you can't call up Ocado every 3 weeks. No, there's only one delivery a year to Halley VI. It's by the research vessel, the Ernest Shackleton, which delivers everything that's needed to support the station through the year, comes up, moors up against the sea ice. Everything is then unloaded, dragged across the sea ice up to the edge of the ice shelf, where the British Antarctic Survey form ramps with bulldozers and then drag it from the sea ice up onto the ice shelf. You can fly in by plane, but only in these small twin otters, which have skis on the bottom. And during the journey, they do have to make a refueling stop as they fly from one station to the other. They refuel by dropping off at remote refueling stations where a few cans of fuel have been left. They have to leave the propellers on so that they can take off in an emergency. When they come into land, the plane comes in, it drops the skis down onto the ice, then quickly takes off again, does a circle round to make sure that no cracks have developed in the ice before landing again and quickly refueling before carrying on its journey. And that plane will carry in about 4 or 5 passengers. So you might think to yourselves, well, it's very cold, it's very windy, it's clearly very isolated, and it's dark for around a quarter of the year. Why would anyone want to live in a place like Halley? And the answer is because the science which is conducted in these Antarctic research stations is of truly global significance. And in fact, it was in the 1980s that 3 British scientists working at Halley Station first noticed the hole in the ozone layer, which subsequently led to the Montreal Protocol banning the use of CFCs, which to this day probably remains one of the most important pieces of global legislation in our fight against climate change. But around about 2000, British scientists also noticed that there was a significant problem with the site of Halley V. A series of cracks were noticed developing in the Brunt ice shelf, and Halley V was going to be on the wrong side of a giant crack which would leave that part of the ice shelf breaking off as a huge iceberg. So as a result, they decided to have an architectural design competition. And I remember the day that the competition was launched. I was actually getting my children ready to go to school when I heard the then president of the RIBA, George Ferguson, and the head of the British Antarctic Survey, Chris Rapley, being questioned on question time about what was needed. And I remember they said at the time they were looking for an international architectural practice, probably multidisciplinary, experts in prefabrication and sustainability, with a big portfolio of projects in faraway places. At that time, we were a practice of 3, working in a shed at the back of a building in West London, and our largest project to date was a 200 square metre building for Girl Guides in Wimbledon. So unsurprisingly, I didn't think we stood much of a chance of winning this particular competition. But I teamed up with an engineer from AECOM. He called up some other engineers who lived in Colorado Springs in the USA, and it transpired that they had been working on the US Polar Program for over 20 years, and they flew over and gave us a few hot tips on designing for Antarctica. And over a period of time, our team became shortlisted from an original 86 number of entries down to 6 in a short list, down to 3, and eventually declared as the winners. But before I show you our design, I thought I would show you some of the previous buildings which had been built in Antarctica to give you a flavour of the way through history people have dealt with the ideas of isolation in this icy continent. One of the earliest buildings, of course, is Scott's Discovery Hut at McMurdo in the at the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf on Ross Island. This is Scott's first hut. It was so cold being inside this hut that in fact they didn't live in it. They lived on their ship, the Discovery, and only used this as a logistics centre. They had bought it off some Australian ranchers. It had no insulation whatsoever, but it did have a sun porch for the one sunny day that you get in the Antarctic. This is Shackleton's Nimrod hut from a few years later, a far more comfortable building. Shackleton was notoriously good at looking after all his crew. Everybody slept, ate, and lived in one space, but of course the heat rose gently up to the roof, leaving the ground a little cold. Nonetheless, the building was stuffed with newspaper and cork, which gave it a degree of insulation. Far more comfortable was Sir Edmund Hillary's Trans-Antarctic Expeditionary Hut from 1957, which is at the New Zealand base Scott Base, also on Ross Island. And here you can see in the top left a remnant of Hillary's base, which was recently restored by the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust. Hillary used colour to help people overcome the sensory deprivations of the Antarctic. The rooms were small and cosy. There was reasonably comfortable, and he even brought art down to remind people of the homes they've left behind. More recently, there have been more innovative structures built in the Antarctic. The famous American architect Buckminster Fuller designed a dome which was placed at the very South Pole itself, which the US used as their base for around 25 to 30 years. They placed all the buildings that they lived and worked in inside of the dome, but eventually it got semi-buried by the ice and the structure got crushed by the movement, and eventually it was abandoned in the early 2000s and replaced with a new station. And these are some of the more recent stations in the Antarctic. On the top right there is the replacement for Buckminster Fuller's dome at the South Pole, which sleeps around 200 people in the summer and around 50 in the winter. On the bottom right is the Belgian station, a sleek craft which is zero carbon, used only in the summer. On the bottom left is the engineering tour de force of the German station, which is on the Filcher ice shelf and can be jacked up using hydraulics. And then on the top left is the French-Italian base. And I'm assured that the French don't live in one side and the Italians in the other. They do actually meet. They actually sleep on one side and eat and work on the other. And this one is at Dome C, which is right in the middle of the Antarctic, one of the coldest places on Earth, with winter temperatures often well below -70 degrees Celsius. But the challenge at Halley was altogether different. Because the building is going to be built on a floating ice shelf, which is moving out to the sea, it needed to be relocated. It also needed to be able to lift itself above the rising snow levels. So our solution was to design a series of modules elevated up on hydraulic legs and supported on giant skis so that the legs could lift up, snow could be pushed under, and they could jack themselves above the rising snow level. And then when the time came, they could be lowered down on their ski bases and hauled to a new location. The building is made of a series of modules, and the modules can be used for sleeping, for working, and they can also be used as the energy centers to support all the operations containing generators, containing water production, sewage treatment, fuel storage, and so on. And so pretty much everything that was needed to keep this base in operation could be provided in these blue modules, and they're around about 1,600 square foot in area, or roughly the size of a two-story terraced house in London. However, there were some areas where it was necessary to bring the crew together to support the community living in this icy wasteland. And that could not be supported in one of the blue modules. So for that, we created a much bigger two-story module of around about 5,000 square feet, which contained the dining spaces, kitchens, living spaces, a bar, TV watching areas, and a gym. This is our drawing from the early competition stage. And at that point, we had talked to lots of people who work for the British Antarctic Survey, and we discovered that they all like the outdoors life. They're all really into skiing and climbing and things like that. So we thought, well, we'll give them a staircase, but I'm sure some of them would much rather climb with ropes up to the upper level. So we suggested putting in a climbing wall. But then the British Antarctic Survey's health and safety officer had a look at the drawing and realised that the bar was extremely close to the climbing wall, and a difficult choice had to be made as to which one was going to bite the dust. So sadly, the climbing wall remained just a mere flight of fancy. And here the station, fully completed. It's split in two so that if there is a disaster, the people can escape from one side and live in the other until they can be rescued, which could be many, many months. The science areas are off to the left-hand side, and the living and operational areas are off to the right-hand side. These are the science modules, and the one in the furthest south has got an observatory on the top of it where the scientists can watch the weather coming in and also take measurements every day of the ozone layer, continuing the science which first discovered that hole back in the 1980s. Some of the scientists even have to go deep into the field to look after some of the experiments which are in operation. These are supported by containers which are elevated up on legs, fully insulated inside with all the equipment in. And there have been stories of some of the scientists enjoying the isolation of living in the Antarctic so much that they've ended up retreating to one of these painted containers and sort of in a way living as hermits inside until the crew realize in the rest of the base what's happened and come out and rescue them and try and bring them back into the community. And then on occasion, it's necessary to go even deeper out into the field, living in one of these pyramid polar tents, first invented by Captain Scott for his own expeditions in the Antarctic, where two people can be isolated for up to 3 weeks in bad weather, just living inside the tent. And I remember that our project manager, who was responsible for the construction of Halley, he was actually originally a British Antarctic Survey field expert, so an expert on survival in really hostile conditions. And he took one of the scientists out on a trip into the Antarctic, doing some glaciology. They did get stuck in a storm for 3 weeks. They're now happily married, living in Derbyshire with 3 children. This is the main social module of Halley. It's got this big window at the center. Actually, bizarrely, the black glass is actually the clear glass looking out onto the ice, but it's tinted because of the glare that you get, like a pair of sunglasses. And the white glass actually is translucent, so it lets light into the heart of the building, but it's insulated with a thing like silica gel, like you get around cameras and things like that, which actually has a very high level of thermal insulation. It was actually a product invented by NASA for the re-entry of the space shuttle through the Earth's atmosphere. So it has these very high levels of insulation, but lets good quality light into the space. And this is the space at the heart of the building. In the middle of summer, people drag all the dining tables in here because it's really nice and light, and they also have a really good view out onto the ice shelf. There's a spiral stair that leads to the upper level, and if you're wondering one of the ways to overcome the isolation of living in the Antarctic, one of the devices that you might like to think of having is a good picture of the Queen. The other thing that you might like also is to introduce some timber and nice smelling elements into the building. Remembering that in the Antarctic there really is a sort of multitude of sensory deprivations going on. Some of the things that people find strange when they come back to the UK are spending money. There have been lots of stories of Antarcticans returning back to the UK, going to the pub, ordering a round of drinks, and then leaving and forgetting to pay because they haven't used money for 2.5 years. There are plenty of other things that they're not used to. They don't hear the sound of children for 2.5 years. And of course, they don't see any nature apart from the occasional penguin. So there are no smells of trees or plants or anything like that. So one of the ways that we tried to address that was lining the drum that this staircase goes to the upper level with Lebanese cedar veneer, which gives off a really nice smell. So just a small device to try and help with that sensory deprivation. And then upstairs, we introduced these big domed roof lights so that people could stand within them and watch the incredible displays of the southern lights that you get around Halley. Flexible spaces also that people could meet, they could read, they could watch TV. There's also a gym up at this level. Then at the north end of the station are the two modules that are used for bedrooms. There's also a doctor's surgery. There's also a small cupboard with hair cutting implements inside it. So everything that you need to support you through the isolation of an Antarctic winter is provided within these modules. We work really closely with a colour psychologist, Angela Wright, who came up with a special palette of colours to use throughout the base, what she calls her spring palette, to help people overcome the effects of seasonal affected disorder. So the green is used to signpost the bedroom modules, the yellow is used to signpost the operational modules, there's blue for the science areas, red for the gym, and so on. Each person gets a room to themselves in the winter, and then in the summer they share with someone else and actually enjoy the opportunity to share and have a bit of a chat with someone having lived on their own in a room for 9 months of the year. There's plenty of storage, and Angela even helped us choose the color of the duvets and the pillows. She said peachy pink was the color that you need to help you get a good night's sleep. And here's the station elevated up on its hydraulic legs, supported on giant skis, with all the snow leveled around and about, ready to face up to the hostilities of an Antarctic winter. And in the middle of the winter, it's covered with rime, or a kind of hoarfrost, which freezes to everything. The wind is blowing from the right-hand side. As it reaches the buildings, it accelerates underneath, clearing away all the snowdrift and then forming a massive drift on the leeward side off to the left-hand side. This is a good thing because it means the skis are kept free of snow so that they can be lifted up when the time comes in the jacking process, which elevates the building above the rising snow level. And here's the building as it emerges out of the winter, ready for another Antarctic summer, covered in this rime or hoarfrost, with only the windows giving a clue that there's any life inside, because that's where the heat has melted the ice off the buildings. And here were the most southerly Britons at the time of the Queen's Jubilee, in happier times, playing cricket, playing croquet, and enjoying a cream tea in celebration of the Diamond Jubilee. And if in the Antarctic you don't like where you live, you're not enjoying the isolation where you are, of course, in the Antarctic you can just relocate. And here's a shot of the modules from around about 2016, when the station was first relocated to escape from an impending crack in the ice shelf. Each of the modules was disconnected from the other. It was lowered down on its hydraulic legs and then dragged using bulldozers to a new site around about 15 miles further inland. And here you see the process of relocation. Each of the modules is drawn up in line next to the next one, connected together, and then when they're all in a line again, then using the hydraulic legs, they can be jacked up to face another Antarctic winter. And here the station fully reconnected in its new location. So there are two modules in the bottom right, which are for sleeping. The next one is the command module, where the base commander is, the doctor, the laundry, the IT suites, and so on. The big red one is obviously the living one. Then there are two modules which have got generators and water treatment in, so that if there's any failure of power in one, you can rely on power from the other. And then two modules which are completely devoted over to science. One of the exciting things that happened as a consequence of this project is that it featured on a stamp. It also featured on a coin, a £2 coin, which is only legal tender in the British Antarctic Territory. And then my favourite accolade of this whole project was when a man from Grimsby, who I've never met before, liked the building so much that he tattooed himself with it. I suppose the best thing for us in a way that came as a consequence of the success of Halley VI was that we were invited to get involved with a number of other Antarctic projects. The first project that we were involved with after Halley was Juan Carlos I, which is the Spanish base, which is on Livingston Island, just off the Antarctic Peninsula. So it's a good 500 miles further north than Halley. In the winter, it gets significant snowfall, actually more snowfall than you get at Halley, around 3 meters. But in the summer, all the snow melts. It's a summer-only station, and it's surrounded by some quite extraordinary wildlife. There are big colonies of elephant seals, gentoo and chinstrap penguins. There are also large numbers of leopard seals, which are extremely dangerous. And it's one of the few places in the Antarctic that you actually get any plant life, large areas of mosses and lichens growing on the nutrient-rich Antarctic soils. The seals get absolutely everywhere. So they come up to the buildings, they'll lie on the fuel lines, they'd come into the buildings if they could. Unlike at Halley, there are also neighbours. They're a small base run by the Bulgarians, St. Clement Ohridsky, which is around about 2 miles away from the Spanish base. Bottom right, that's me on a cultural visit to go and see the Bulgarians. I might be looking as if I'm tanned, but actually I'm a little red-faced because we've polished off most of that bottle of raki that you see in the bottom right on the table there. Our solution for the design of Juan Carlos was different than that for Halley because the building didn't need to move. Also, the wind blows from every single direction. So in order to bind the community together, we came up with the idea of a Y-shaped building with bedrooms in 2 wings and the living space in the 3rd wing, and everybody needing to cross over this central yellow bit in the middle so that people are almost intentionally bumping into each other, having an opportunity for a chat before they go about the day's business. This is one of our computer-generated images in the early stages of the design. And the building has these big windows at the end of each wing, because one of the things we've discovered, I suppose it was pretty obvious, but that people who go to the Antarctic tend to love the Antarctic, and they really want every opportunity that they can to look on to the amazing landscapes that you see round and about. And these big windows with triple glazing allow them to really get involved with the Antarctic landscapes, even from the warmth of their dining room or other lounge spaces. The building is raised up on legs, but there are areas at the bottom. The reason it's arranged like that is because when the this station is only used in the summer. When they turn up in around about October time, remembering that the months are upside down because it's in the southern hemisphere, when they turn up in October to move into the building for the next 5 months, they will find that there's around about 3 meters or 10 foot of snow burying the lower level. And so they can more or less just walk into the upper level on the snow. But over the summer, the snow will melt, and then they need an entrance lower down. So hence there's 2 stories. It's raised just a little bit off the ground because as all that snow melts, so it creates a huge amount of water around the station, and that just allows the water to flow underneath. It also meant that the buildings damaged as little as possible the lichens and mosses that you get on Livingston Island. And here you see the building complete. It was actually only occupied last year. There was a big gap between finishing the outside and the inside as a result of the financial crisis that was particularly hard hitting in Spain. But it is now in occupation and used by around 40 scientists during the summer. So there's the main Y building and then a series of other smaller buildings that are used for science, for boat sheds, the generators and so on, which in this case are separated to reduce fire risk and also to reduce risk of any other damage from wind or so on. Currently, we're working on a 3rd project for the British Antarctic Survey at Rothera Station. Rothera Station is on Adelaide Island, pretty much on the peninsula of the Antarctic in a spectacularly beautiful location. It's Britain's main hub of Antarctic operations, actually has quite a long runway with planes from a number of different nations flying through the station on their way to deep field science camps. It's home to around 100 people during the summer and around about 20, maybe down to 15 during the winter. The building that we're designing at the moment for the British Antarctic Survey serves a number of different uses. It serves science offices, it serves administrative spaces, it's got the main medical facility within there, all the main stores for the base, the science preparation areas, recreational spaces, the vehicle workshop, and also all the main generators and plant which keep the station operational. And at the top is a big control tower for controlling aircraft coming in and out of Rothera Station, and also the ship operations delivering all the cargo for Rothera. And here you can see the runway at the heart of Rothera Station and the blue building, which is replacing a series of smaller and now old buildings as part of a master plan to radically alter the way in which Rothera operates, with far fewer smaller buildings and with about 3 or 4 much bigger buildings. Internally, we've used colour quite a bit, again, drawing upon the lessons we learnt from Angela Wright in terms of bringing colour to bear in the battle against seasonal affected disorder. There's also quite a few open plan spaces to drive collaboration between the community. It's also really important that open plan transparency that you get within these buildings in the depths of the winter, because when there's so few people living in the buildings, it's really important then you can just catch a sight of someone at work, raise your hand, say, yep, seen you, everything's safe. It's a good way of maintaining everybody's well-being and ensuring everybody is safe on base. And here you see a view of what the station will look like in the depths of the winter, with the aurora flashing around here on Adelaide Island. And the last project I'm going to show you is the biggest one we've ever done in the Antarctic. It's the redevelopment of the New Zealand base, Scott Base, where Hillary first established a base for the New Zealanders in 1957. And we're now designing the new iteration of Scott Base. This is the current station. It's made up of 11 interconnected buildings linked together, but each serving a different function, whether it's science, water production, sleeping, sewage treatment, dining areas, operational areas, vehicle maintenance, and so on. The problem with the base is those buildings were originally built in the 1980s, and there are now a number of issues making the operation severely compromised, and in some places making it truly unsafe. There are lots of different levels, which means it's really inefficient. So whenever anything is delivered, you have to carry it in boxes on a trolley, and then you get to a short flight of stairs, you have to pick it up, move it up to the next level, find another trolley, move it on. Many of the building services are in really restricted areas under the floor, making it extremely difficult to get to them. A lot of the equipment is really, really old, in particular the water treatment, meaning that at any time they could lose the use of water on the base, which obviously would be a total disaster. The fire safety is compromised in many areas. So just imagine having to escape out of that door there. You open the door and then you have to swing round onto that ladder before you can climb down onto the ground. Because of the orientation of the buildings and the strong winds which blow over the Ross Ice Shelf, you get massive snowdrifts forming in the lee side of all the buildings, which then freeze solid and cause severe damage to the outsides. And in some cases, that snow just collects on the roof and people have to climb up there and chisel it away to prevent it causing serious leaks and damage to the roofs themselves. So we started the process of redesign by thinking about lots of different ways in which we could approach the redesign of a building in this location. And bizarrely for the Antarctic, it's a really hemmed in site. There's science installations, there's a coast, there's a road that leads on to a large American base, and there are also a number of rare lichens and mosses on this site too, all of which meant we had very little ground in which to plan new buildings. But our solution was to elevate the buildings above the ground to allow the wind to blow underneath to prevent snow drifts from congregating around the edges of the buildings, and also to split them into 3 so that you could have one for sleeping, one for science and administration, and one for workshops, storage, and all the equipment that's needed to operate a base of this kind. The buildings are all connected, however, and as they step down the hillside, it means that the lowest level of the upper building connects to the upper level of the middle building, and the lower level of the bottom building connects to the upper level of the bottom building. And there are lifts and staircases in each to make the movement of equipment and people around the base as easy and as efficient as possible. So we go from this collection of interconnected small green metal buildings to this simpler arrangement of 3 larger buildings connected by bridges, and then 1 4th building, which is used as a helicopter hangar. And here you can see the precariousness of living in the Antarctic. This is part of Ross Island. This is the place where Captain Scott first stepped foot on the Antarctic. It's where he mounted his fateful expedition to go to the South Pole in 1912. And that hill that you see in the background, Observation Hill, is where his team climbed up to on a regular basis to see if they could see him and his companions coming back from the South Pole. And when they eventually realized that they'd all perished on the Ross ice shelf, they erected a giant timber cross on the top of that hill called Observation Hill in memory of Scott's fateful expedition. As part of our project to design Scott Base, we've had to engage with the Maori community in New Zealand in a fascinating process to ensure that the base feels not only appropriate for its Antarctic setting, but also brings the best of New Zealand culture to bear, so that it feels like a proper home from home for the scientists and staff who will work there. And part of that process meant that we had to stay overnight in a Maori marae or meeting house in what's called a hui, where we discussed all those features of New Zealand life which could play a part in the design of the new Scott Base. This is the proposed outside of the building, and one of those features of New Zealand construction, New Zealand buildings, which is so apparent, is the idea of welcome, which is why the principal facade has got this big window looking into the dining room and also glazing leading to the entrance of the building, almost reaching out saying, hello, come in, you're welcome here. And in fact, the first space you come into in the building is a welcome lounge lined in Southland beech, which is a timber from the South Island, using particular colour palette, which is so common in New Zealand, of darkened floors and muted colours symbolising the earth, cocooning you against the cold of the Antarctic, but at the same time revealing the splendour of the landscape all around. There's a really nice Maori principle, which is of looking backwards as you head into the future. And that's very much a principle which has underpinned the design of the public spaces within the building. So from that welcome lounge, you emerge into this entrance area, which has displays from some of the great heroic expeditions which have been mounted in the Antarctic, both by the New Zealand, Antarctica New Zealand, but also by some of the explorers, Scott, Shackleton, Amundsen, and so on, from those great historical expeditions. And in fact, here you see part of the Ross Island Party's sledge on display. There are also boards explaining the history of expedition in this part of Antarctica. So this is very much a view on the past, but the design is very much a view onto the future. This is inside the dining room, again lined with the timber, the Southland beech timber, with this huge window looking towards Mount Erebus and Mount Terror, which were both named after the ships of Captain Ross's expedition of the 1840s, which sailed down to the Antarctic, was actually away from home, isolated in Antarctica for 3 years. Within the building, there are places for people to get together. There are also places where only a few people can sit quietly and contemplate the magnificence of the place that they're living within. This is a library or quiet lounge at one end of the building looking out towards the Royal Society range. We've designed the base with 60 single rooms and 40 twin rooms. The single rooms are all pretty small. They're around about 2 meters or 6 foot wide and around 3.5 meters long, or 10 to 11 foot long. There's plenty of space for self-expression. So an opportunity for all those New Zealanders to pin up pictures of the All Blacks, penguins, or Captain Scott's hut. They all have a good view out onto the ice. And then at the heart of the building, there are twin rooms for people who are just passing through for shorter periods, many of the scientists coming only to Scott Base for a week or 2 weeks at a time before going out and conducting their research in the deep Antarctic landscapes, could be many hundreds of miles away. The buildings are connected by link bridges, which we also saw again as an opportunity, not only for people to look out onto the landscape, but also to just stop and have a chat. So they're wide enough for someone who's wheeling a pallet through and other people to walk past, also stop and have a chat and look out on the landscape. And I have to admit that this image was inspired just a tiny, tiny bit by a little predilection I have for the Star Wars movies. And here you can see the potential of that space in the middle of winter, where the crew might be able to drag out some mattresses, lie on the floor and just marvel at the amazing southern lights and starry skies that you get in this part of the Antarctic. The idea of promoting collaboration is a really important feature of the design of buildings in the Antarctic, because you get a real mix of people from engineers, administrators, and of course plenty of scientists researching some of the really pressing issues to do with climate change that the world is facing at the moment. And it's really nice if they can collaborate together, learn from each other. So you might find a climatologist can learn from a marine biologist, that a base commander can learn from a plant operator. So we're really keen on having open plan spaces where people can get together both to work or for informal discussion to find out what people are up to, look after each other, and also to just learn from each other's disciplines. So the science labs have all got glazed screens to them, so you can see in. It's just another way also of making sure people are safe. So if a scientist's working there on their own, they can be seen by other people, and if something goes wrong, they can be quickly rescued and dragged out. And that philosophy extends right through to the most industrial spaces within the building, things like the vehicle workshops, which are overlooked by the gym and the office of the trades workers, so the vehicle mechanics, the carpenters, and so on. So that there's this constant visual connection between people going about their daily work to make sure that people are safe and that they have a sense of community. Nonetheless, meaning that the base can sit relatively modestly in its surroundings, ready to face up to the Antarctic winter. And I think that is my last slide. So if I can hand over to you, Pippa, at this point, I think that's me done.
I'm now gonna take some questions.
Hi, this is Karen. I just wanted to know, great presentation, by the way, thank you so much. How are the buildings heated?
So the stations are heated. There are different approaches at each one. So at Halley, they have a number of generators to provide all the electrical power to help the station to run. And the generators produce quite a bit of heat themselves purely by their operation. And that heat is captured and used to heat the building. But the buildings don't take as much heat as you'd imagine because they're so well insulated, and there's quite a bit of heat generated anyway by all the different electrical devices, the people, the cooking, that kind of thing. But all the heat there is provided by combined heat and power generators. At Scott Base, there's actually a huge wind farm above the base, which was actually put in by New Zealand a few years ago and will be extended as part of our project. And so there's a surplus of electrical power generated through wind. So all the boilers in Scott Base are actually electric boilers. So they will provide all the heat. So there's a plan that in the very long term, Scott Base will also be zero carbon, even though it's a year-round station, which will be quite an achievement, bearing in mind the hostility of the environment that it's in. But that's how that's heated.
Hey,
That was really interesting. I'm just wondering when construction begins on the New Zealand station, and are there any other stations that are yet to be finished?
Yeah, so the New Zealand station, construction on the New Zealand station will start in around 2022. There's quite a lot of earthworks that need to be done to level the site out, and the existing base needs to be decommissioned and removed. So it could take around about 6 years to complete, so 6 to 7 years. So it should be operational by around 2028, 2029. Actually, there's quite a bit of work going on in the Antarctic at the moment. There are proposals on the drawing board or in the first sort of throes of construction from the USA, from Australia, from China, from India, and the UK themselves. Because of I guess, the importance of understanding Antarctica and its overall contribution to climate weather systems and to understanding climate change itself, there's a huge amount of investment from many nations into Antarctic science, which is kind of manifested with the construction of buildings and bases. I think Korea is also doing some work at the moment, Peru, Russia. It's amazing how much work is going on there.
Wow. Yeah.
Thank you, Misha. Hugh, have you ever been to see the Halley station yourself? The Halley station yourself?
Yep, I was really lucky. I actually went twice. I went to visit the original base, Halley V, and then right towards the end of the construction, I actually went out and did the snagging, which is when you go and check all the things that aren't quite right and work with the builder to get them right. And we had another architect from our office who was there in the middle of the construction when all the outer panels were being installed. One of the things, though, about these buildings is that they do tend to be largely prefabricated, whether in kit form or even as whole buildings. So you do tend to get to see all the construction components in a warmer climate before they get shipped and then clipped together in the Antarctic. So we actually built whole ones of the blue module and even the red module in Cape Town in South Africa, so we could check it all went together before it was shipped to the Antarctic. So you can do most of your work remotely, but yeah, nonetheless, I did get to go and visit Halley a couple of times, and then also the Spanish base and a couple of times to the New Zealand base.
Who determines exactly what can and can't be built over there? Obviously, there's no sort of local planning authority to give the final sign off. But I wondered if it was done by sort of, I don't know, the equivalent of Section of State of the area of the Arctic you're in, or something like that, or more of a joined up approach between the countries.
So actually, there is a really joined up approach between all the different countries, all the signatories of what's called the Antarctic Treaty. I can't remember the precise number, but it's around, I think there's around about 45 signatories to the Antarctic Treaty now. And they have an annual meeting, the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. And if you want to carry out a significant piece of construction, then you have to submit what's called a comprehensive environmental evaluation, which informs all the other nations about the design and particularly the environmental footprint, and justifies it on the basis of the scientific research that you will be carrying out. And then all the nations review that, pass comment on it. Any nation as well who's a signatory to the Antarctic Treaty can also visit anybody else's base to make sure that they've built exactly what they said. So it's not quite like the planning system that we have in the UK or in other countries, but nonetheless, there is a significant environmental sort of checking process which is in place to minimize people's footprint and ensure that they build exactly what they say they're going to build.
I just wanted to ask a question, Hugh, which was about people in isolation. And do people often end up having relationships when they're stuck out together in the Antarctic?
Yeah, that's pretty commonplace. And there are quite a few people who've ended up finding their other half whilst working in the Antarctic. There are also, unfortunately, quite a few incidences where people might partner up with someone at the beginning of the season, dump them in the middle, and then decide to partner up with someone else towards the end of the season, which can cause quite a lot of heartbreak and anxiety amongst quite a small crew. Yeah, it's pretty commonplace. Our project manager, who's currently running the Scott-based project, is actually married to an American who was working at the American base nearby. And as I said, the project manager we had for Halley also met his wife whilst guiding her on a deep field science event for the British operating out of Rothera. So yeah, pretty commonplace.
Excellent. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up there, and I'd like everyone to join me again in thanking Hugh, and just to remind you, next week we have Piers Taylor. So thank you very much, Hugh.
Thank you.
There's the Broughton boys. Clapping for the thing.